So why do we choose open book assessments? So if we could go to the next slide. One of the top benefits is that it reduces test anxiety. And there's students have a high degree of satisfaction with open book exams, but not necessarily a higher performance in grades. It promotes higher order thinking skills using the upper levels of Bloom's taxonomy. It provides the opportunity for learner to have some self-directed discovery of knowledge, as the exam itself is a learning experience. And there's some disagreement in the literature about whether this results in deep learning or superficial learning. Students tend to have more time to reflect. In a professional environment, it's you can use more authentic tasks, more case studies, and in addition to demonstrating discipline-specific knowledge, you develop professional skills such as how to communicate effectively, how to use persuasive writing, how to gather and integrate information from various sources. And to me, a minor advantage is that it will reduce requests for accommodation. We have the next slide, Amy, please. So we have academic integrity. There's less chance of students cheating or other unethical behaviors.
So I will just kind of butt in and note that at the end of this presentation, we will be talking a lot about academic integrity and kind of the challenges. So don't worry, we will get into it. Sorry, go ahead, Beth.
That's okay. We're developing effective exam questions. So they're complex, open-ended questions that require thorough understanding of the course material and not just recall. And so we're testing higher order thinking skills. One of the concerns that we have is that students have a misconception that they don't need to know the material. And they don't prepare for the exam the same way as they would for a closed book exam. Marking may be time consuming. But you'll find that it's well worth the time. And then scheduling. Do you do it within the regular class time or in the exam period? Or when do you do it? And that can be a challenge. So the next slide, Amy. I'm going to pass it over to Amy to talk about how to best implement.
Okay, so we're going to chop this up into a few kind of sections, and then, like I said, we'll get into some extra kind of pieces towards the end about kind of more so shaping the questions that you're asking and getting into a bit more about academic integrity and things you can do to help maintain that in the open book assessment. So the main things that we advocate for and that the research and literature behind this advocates for is defining the task, providing the students with context, and providing them with very clear instructions. So those are three really important things that you need to make sure that you cover for them. So the first one, obviously, we always advocate for making sure that your learning outcomes are clear, and that you're focusing those outcomes on the higher order things. So like analyzing, evaluating, and creating. So if we're just kind of relying on I realize we still have a nursing example in here. If we're just going to rely on recall, then open book is going to pose a challenge because you don't know if you're actually measuring the students' recall or their ability to kind of look things up quickly. And if your assessment, you're fine with measuring either of those things, if it's the kind of subject where them being able to retrieve information as part of it, then that's not an issue, but otherwise you want to stick to the higher order. So we did do this presentation recently for nursing, so we kind of highlighted the example of using kind of contemporary, like something that's going on in the world now, real nursing problem, and of course that you can kind of apply that to your own subject. So something that's happening currently in the research, for example, something that's in the news, this kind of thing. And making sure that the task is very clear and unambiguous, and that's going to take some troubleshooting sometimes. So even when you're doing that, run it by another colleague, run it by, if you have grad students, get them to look it over and make sure it's clear, and just allowing students to have feedback and questions right away so that if you have to adjust something to make it clear, you can. So how to provide the context. So here we're looking at, kind of defining those details of the class, defining what resources you're going to allow them to use. And in thinking about that, we really encourage you to think about what resources you can control. So we have had some people venture out in the world of open book exams and say, well, we don't want our students to use the internet. Well, can you actually control that aspect? You could use a lockdown browser, that will help. You can do a lot of things to kind of reinforce their value around academic integrity, but you might find that students are going to use a different device, beside the one they're using. So that's something that you have some control over, but not a lot, not total control, let's say it that way. So you might want to take things like that into consideration when you're choosing what resources you're going to allow them to use. If we're talking about having an environment where you're on campus in a computer lab, then things like that become a little bit easier. What are your expectations for the responses? So this is particularly challenging for students. They want to know, how much should they be writing? Are they allowed to write point form? What happens if they use something from the text? Do they need to reference it? Do they need to say things in their own words? Are they allowed to grab a figure from the text and use that to kind of highlight their understanding? So all of these kind of things, how they're using those resources and what you're expecting from a response is really important. And honestly, the best way to do that is to provide examples. All right, how to provide the instructions for students. So when we're talking about the remote environment, the release date and time becomes very important. How much time they have to complete. And I have this subpoint there of what will occur when the time expires. So if you're using the quiz tool, for instance, in Brightspace, there are a few different choices that you have for when time expires. So you can allow them a little bit of a grace period, like I usually build in a 5-minute grace period into my course. And during that grace period, they can still write. So for me, that's, time for them to finish up a sentence, kind of analogous to when, students are still kind of madly writing as you're walking up the aisle to collect the exam kind of thing. So allowing them to just kind of finish off whatever point they're trying to make. And then you also have the option of, what happens when the time is completely up? Is it just kind of labeled as late, but they can keep writing? Does it completely turn off for them? And giving your students a heads up of what's going to happen is really important so that they don't panic. So for example, I usually use the one where after the grace period, they can't enter any more information. But I make it clear to them that they can still submit and they still have to submit. So don't freak out and walk away from your computer, and don't worry when you hit submit, whatever you've written so far is there. Because if you don't point those out to the students, they will kind of panic a little bit. Of course, kind of saying what topics are covered in the assessment, what the approved materials are, like we talked about, the resources, what the word length is, what they're expected to do with respect to referencing. So what kind of sources need referencing? Does the textbook need referencing? Does information from the lecture need referencing? Or is it just academic papers that need referencing? And how do you want those referenced, obviously? The format, not only with the referencing, but with the questions. Are they allowed to use point form, or does everything have to be paragraph? How to submit it, and how to ask for help. So there's a few different ways that you can do that, but most common is just kind of having some kind of synchronous way to interact with you during the exam. So obviously, if you're on campus in a classroom, you can be there to go around and ask questions. When we're talking about online or the remote environment, then you might want to set up, kind of a Zoom or WebEx room where students can come into a waiting room. So you let them in one at a time. And that way they can ask you questions during the exam. Or if you have a longer time span, you can also do that by email. Student preparation. So this is where we have not only the misconceptions that students have, but just kind of making sure that they're ready, that they have the technology that they need, they have time allotted to do the exam. So this list kind of goes over a lot of things. I won't go through all of them, but just kind of basically making sure that they know what's coming, that they're not scrambling at the last minute, trying to figure out, how this is all going to work, that you've had some kind of time, maybe at the end of one class, where they can you can run through how it all works, and they can ask anything that they don't quite understand about the instructions, and really advocate for them to make sure that they have a nice quiet space to work, that they have anything that could potentially cause a great interruption kind of managed, and they have support for that, especially if they're having that really tight time constraint example for like an hour for a midterm. All right, with respect to student misconceptions, obviously they tend to sometimes think that they can just look up the answers from the book. Sometimes looking up extra detail from the book is fine, but even for that, if they don't know where it is in the book and can't grab it quickly, then that's going to be also very troublesome. Other students kind of feel that because of this, it's going to be really easy. They don't have to study. And then you also have kind of during the exam where students will just start kind of throwing tons of information into answers that not only eats up their time while they're doing the exam, but it also makes it extremely hard to mark, because you're trying to sift through all of this extraneous information as you look for the answer. So we will kind of go through a little bit of how you can kind of help with those misconceptions as we go through the design. I do want to pause before you go on, Daphne, just to see if anybody has any questions so far, or anything that they've seen so far that they have tried, any experiences you've had. So we'll just kind of have a minute, maybe a little bit of an awkward silence, to see if anybody wants to bring anything up. And I'll remind you too that the chat window is also there. I guess the only other thing to note is that I'm not sure how Ustaina has it set up. Along with the chat, there is a question and answer thing that only Ustaina has access to. So if you do want to ask me or Daph a question, please use the chat and not the submit a question portion of WebEx. I should have said that at the start of the presentation, so sorry for that. All right, well, seeing no questions, Daph, do you want to introduce
Sure.
this section?
So I'm going to talk a little bit about the design of assessment, look at question styles, the challenges and complexity, and a little bit on case studies. So can we have the next slide, Amy?
Mm-hmm.
So if you're using Brightspace, I would strongly recommend using the question library. And use sections within the question library. So if you've got Unit 1 questions, you've got a subsection that will have warm-up questions. And you might have 6 warm-up questions in there, which you're going to randomly select 2. These warm-up questions are of similar difficulty, covering similar topics. And so students get a similar difficulty exam. Within the question, if it's multiple choice, randomize the options so that if students want to collaborate, it makes it a little more challenging for them to collaborate. Sort of increases your academic integrity a bit. Random select questions, randomize the questions so that they come in different order. And if you're using the question library and you're using sections, randomize the sections when you create your quiz. Can I have the next slide? So this slide gives you a resource that talks about the various types of questions within Brightspace. And I've divided them into 2 groups for this presentation. There's the auto-graded, the multiple choice, fill in the blank, matching, ordering, those sorts of questions. And then the instructor graded, the short answer and the essay style. Can I have the next slide? Thank you. So the multiple choice, that includes the true false, which I try to avoid because they're too easy to guess. Multiple select, and again, we've got nursing, hangovers from the nursing presentation. Sorry about that. And multi-select is where there's more than one correct answer and students have to select all of the correct answers. And you can get partial marks for if they've selected 2 out of 3 correct answers, you can get 2/3 points for that. Matching, ordering, fill in the blank. These are all auto-graded. And they're usually lower order, although multiple choice and multiple select can be much higher order. So for the multiple choice, we're going to look at the higher order thinking. Avoid the questions that can be answered directly. So the direct recall, so use multiple step questions. And use case studies wherever possible. So can we have the next slide? This is Bloom's taxonomy. At the base, we have remembering, low order skill. And we move up through understanding. So students actually have to demonstrate that they can explain, interpret, compare, discuss. Above that, we have apply, where they demonstrate, classify, design. Then we move up to analyze, investigate, distinguish, compare, separate. Above analyzing is evaluating, judging, selecting, justifying, debating, discussing, recommending, rating. And at the very top, we have creating, inventing, composing, predicting, planning. We have the next slide. So if we're creating a case study, we want it authentic. We want appropriate names. We want it culturally appropriate. So if you're situating a case study in rural Newfoundland, you want to have a name that would be appropriate for the community in rural Newfoundland that you've selected. You want to make sure that you have things that are culturally appropriate and that your problem is realistic. Provide full information, and there's a fine line between providing full information and providing too much information. And you can add to the information of the case as the case progresses. When you're creating a case, check with colleagues. Have them read it to make sure that it's authentic and legitimate and it can be answered. Ensure that your questions are higher order and that the questions are contextual. So instructor graded questions, that's your short answer, your essay style. And I would encourage you to consider including at least one of these in your assessment. I know it's difficult when you've got large classes, but it's well worth the time that you spend doing it. I think that you get a huge sense of gratification from finding out what the students are actually capable of doing. So your short answer can be a sentence or two. The essay, include personal experience and reflection so that it's difficult to cheat. And I'm going to pass it over to Amy to talk about academic integrity.
Okay, I will have a little add-on there for the essay question. I tend to teach larger classes, so not quite the 200 number, but more floating in between like 70 to 100, somewhere around there. And I find, I know it's kind of hard to get longer questions marked exactly how you want by TAs, but I do find that that I can use my TAs to initially mark the longer answer questions, give them a good rubric so that they know what's worth what with respect to points. And then I find it allows me to really kind of have more efficiency when I go in to then look at, because then I become more so the auditor instead of the initial marker. If I see that a TA has given someone full marks on something, I know that that person has picked up the points from the rubric, and I don't have to look at that answer quite as closely. So then I end up focusing more on, you know, students who scored, you know, kind of poorly, and often that's a little bit in part because the TA is not as familiar with the content or isn't aware of some points that were made in class, that kind of stuff, and then I can go in and pick up on that. So even with the larger classes, marking doesn't have to be quite as onerous as you think it's going to be if you can utilize some of the resources like the TAs, if you are lucky enough to have TAs. All right, so academic integrity. And again, I'll just remind you, if you have any questions, we do have the chat window there. Feel free to throw them up, and I do not mind being interrupted at all. So what I'm going to kind of focus on is looking at kind of developing that accountability in your students, and then looking at the question design and the different expectations around academic integrity. All right, so right off the bat, you should have some stuff in your syllabus. It's university regulations that you have at least that statement on academic integrity. Sometimes people might just have the statement and then refer the students, you know, kind of to the university calendar. And sometimes you can go a step further and kind of explain a little bit more in the context of your course what those regulations mean. So what constitutes a violation of academic integrity and how you'll deal with it if you see it happening. Reminding students about that, that Integrity 1000 course that's run through the library. Direct students to the writing center if it's, you know, kind of a longer written assignment or having trouble with like citations and stuff like that, or another academic support center if you have one available to you through your departments. Making sure that they understand how to do the citations, and also leading by example within, you know, your own lectures as well. So not only showing them how to do it in the instructions for an assignment, but also making sure that you're doing the same thing as you present material in your lectures, and that way they can constantly and consistently see how things should be cited and what types of things should be cited. All right, so looking at things like accountability, the question design and expectations, starting off with, you know, kind of setting up that, that aspect in your course. So having things very contextualized will help kind of prevent some of that cheating, because they can't just hop on Course Hero or something and find the exact same answer if it's contextualized to, you know, kind of our local experience, for instance, or to a particular research paper that just recently came out. If you can personalize questions, that will help as well. If they are working in a group or something like that, and they have to also kind of discuss what exactly happened in that group, then that also kind of cuts down a lot on that contract cheating that we see a little bit more of these days. And then kind of randomly assigning things, whether or not it's, you know, the randomization of questions and sections and stuff like that that Daph talked about, or actually having different question sets or different assignments going out to different students. So of course, if you do something like that, you have to really kind of make sure that you're comfortable with the equivalency between the different questions, and that it's fair to students no matter what question they end up getting. Having students justify their answers, so they just can't give you the answer, they have to explain how they came to it. Of course, again, with the proper citing and referencing, sometimes a student might not be intentionally trying to violate academic integrity or try to find a loophole or get around anything, but they just don't realize that this is how you have to cite information, otherwise it's plagiarism. So teaching them these things go hand in hand with them becoming more responsible and accountable for their work. And the other thing that we see a lot more of these days is getting students to kind of, sometimes it's really strict and it's kind of like a contract at the start of the course. Sometimes it's just a question at the start of the exam that kind of reminds them that they're expected to follow kind of the guidelines for academic integrity. So this is a question, this is an example of that kind of a question. So you would have it at the start of your assignment or your exam, and it basically just says, I understand and will abide by Memorial University's academic regulations. Specifically, I will, not consult with classmates, not share questions, use only the permitted resources. So this is just a way to have a little bit of a reminder and make sure that they've actually read it, because it's a question that they actually have to answer. Another kind of option is to do this kind of thing a little bit, in advance of them getting the assignment, to make sure that they're not planning any kind of collaboration or anything before they get in there. Excuse me. All right. So other things that you can do to kind of help reduce kind of that urge that students may have to cheat is make sure that you're focusing on their learning experiences. They're not going into an exam really worried that they don't have the skills to actually do the exam or do the work. Avoid relying solely on publishers' test banks, because those do tend to be what ends up being published on a lot of those tutoring websites. So they get posted up as kind of a resource, but then if you're, constantly using questions from those test banks, then the students have access to that and the answers. Reducing kind of the, what's the word I'm looking for, the stakes of the exam. So the higher the stakes for a quiz or exam or midterm, the more chance that those who are kind of considering cheating, the more chance that they will, if they think that they have a lot to lose by getting something wrong. So allowing them a little bit of freedom there, dropping the lowest mark, having a little bit of an adjustment, for time or something like that built in. Something that gives them a little bit of flexibility will help reduce the incidence of cheating as well. And building confidence in your students, making them feel like they do have the skills and the abilities to do this exam without having to resort to cheating. Oh, thought we had another slide after that, but we don't. There was one example that I wanted to bring up. Daph, maybe you can remind me. You said, bring that up in the session. I guess it was just about the time shift, maybe. So I had a very kind of strict timeline for my midterm. So the test was kind of designed to be 50 minutes, but I made it a very tight time. So I did have some recall because of the nature of the course. It's an introductory cell course. And so there was some recall that I wanted to test with them, but I didn't want them to be able to look up kind of every answer in the book. So I did have a tight, quite a bit of information in a tight time frame. I did have some of my best students still be able to finish it, no problem. But I knew that it would be rough for some students, that they would have a hard time with the time limit. And so, what I said to them was basically that I would build in a shift if I needed to, if I found that a lot of people weren't able to get to some of the questions, or things were kind of obviously rushed. So not so much that people are answering questions and getting them wrong. That's kind of more so demonstrating that, they misunderstood the information. But if if they're actually not able to answer things. And so in the end for my exam, once I got through it all and I kind of had my own little formula for figuring out how I wanted to shift things, but I did end up adding 4% to all of their grades to bring it up to the average that I know I usually have in this course, and kind of calculating how many questions were missed, how much those questions were usually worth, that kind of thing. And I explained all that out to the students. So they knew I wasn't just trying to be a big bully, that there was a reason for there being the tight time constraint to prevent people from just looking everything up. And I was impressed. I didn't have anybody, like I solicit feedback from my students all the time. I didn't have anybody have any issues with it. And everybody was pretty happy with their marks. So things like that are some kind of considerations as well. Kind of stop and think about things from the student's point of view as much as you can, and try to make it as fair as you can. That will also kind of build confidence with the students as well. Okay, so I think we're okay to kind of open it up to questions. I'm going to stop sharing my screen if that's okay, but we can always pop back to it.